And I can get the both of you at Shakespeare.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
So hard. You guys are Bill. Thank you.
Got a thing in his head.
Welcome everyone, although that was a TED. Are you tired of watching porn? Or maybe you want to watch porn, but you can't because you're at the library or your grandmother's house. What are you going to do? Hang out with your friends? You don't have any friends. Read a book? Let's be honest. Books are boring, and you're semi-illiterate anyways. I know. What about watching a TED Talk? 17 minutes and you're on your way to a life-inspiring journey of hope, technology, and peace. Welcome, everyone. This is TED.
She got by.
TED has taken over the world. But have you ever asked yourself why and how? Let's start with the numbers. 17. Not 15, not 10, 17. That's a pretty cool number, if you ask me. In 17 minutes, you can try to impress your friends by giving them information that's not really information. Because let's be honest, you can't learn anything meaningful in just 17 minutes. The beauty of TED, however, is that it fools you into thinking you can. Information, 17 minutes, easy peasy. It's right at your fingertips. How can we know if we can trust TED? Because it's online, silly. That's why. Also, TED is backed by Silicon Valley and oligarchs, the two most trusted groups of people in the known universe. TED is so powerful that everyone wants in. But now we have too many people for TED to allow in. What do? That's where TEDx comes in. TEDx offers a platform to anybody, however unqualified they are, to have a TED Talk of their very own. We can share points of view using the same boring cadence of every TED Talk that you know and love. The same tone of voice and the same pattern. What is more, TEDx always offers you beautiful generic bar graphs. Because let's get real, no information is worth knowing about unless it's expressed on the graph. And look at the graph. There's so many colors and so many categories. How can you not buy into it? This is TED and information at its best.
Hi, my
TED
daughter.
provides
Come on, film.
all the latest info.
Say hi.
Science, industry, self-help. Stories to keep your mind off the mind-numbing existence that is late capitalism. TED is always optimistic and it will never let you down. Are you worried or concerned about the 6th largest extinction event in the history of the Earth? Don't worry, TED has lasers for that. TED is a wondrous album. To explore your mind with revelation after revelation. All we need is just those 17 minutes of your time.
Do these people not know that it's very chilly outside?
Maybe it's meant to wear inside.
That's a bit much.
If you played that,
It's stupid not to buy the internet that is TED. TED couldn't be bad if so many people like it. Yep.
I bet that Parker.
dangerous because people claim to be victims of it. So just beyond that. How you doing, Ian? How's it going?
That makes him legit.
Yeah, I'll probably.
How'd it feel?
Most likely.
Right. I've always wanted to stick my. I've never, you know, like you always see it in cartoons and stuff, like spaghetti or like the grapes, and I like it.
Just let me know. Oh, deal.
Yeah, it's like
Well, that's
it's a weird
no big deal.
sensation. My eyes were closed. Yeah, when you told me that it was an eyeball, I'm by it.
See you, Mike. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Peter Steeves. Apart from being professor of philosophy here at DePaul, it's also my privilege to be the director of the DePaul Humanities Center. I'm pleased to welcome you to the center's 5th annual Halloween celebration, The Horror of the Humanities. I hope that you enjoyed our interpretation once again of a haunted house out in the lounge. I especially want to thank Matthew Gearson's Human the Clown, Logan Breitbart for his nightmarish poetry, Maurice Meyer, our resident tarot reading witch, and Danielle Meyer, our horrific TED speaker, all of whom helped provide the live entertainment for the last half hour. On this 5th anniversary of The Horror of the Humanities, we will be celebrating a truly fantastic movie and its very talented writer and director. But we first begin, as we always begin at the Humanities Center, by acknowledging the traditional territory upon which we gather this evening. Long before Europeans arrived, varied and numerous native people sought to walk gently on this land. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory, sharing their knowledge for survival and living a good life. Among others, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Miami, and Illinois inhabited what is now this part of Chicago. While we here today have no power to honor the treaties that were signed, we do recognize that these treaties were brokered under some duress and deception. So it's our hope tonight to honor the good faith with which the native people of the region entered into these treaties. As Potawatomi Chief Matea is purported to have said at the signing of the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, quote, "This is a small piece of land, and if we give it away, what will become of us? The Great Spirit who has provided it for our use allows us to keep it. We should incur his anger if we bartered it away. If we had more land, you should get more, but our land has been wasting away ever since the white people became our neighbors, and we now have hardly enough left to cover the bones of our tribe." In solidarity with Chief Matea, we recognize the history and legacy of this subjugation, as well as the enduring presence today of Native Americans among our faculty, staff, student body, and community. And it's thus that we seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on true respect, as we also reaffirm our general and driving dedication to finding ways both institutionally and personally for the work we do at the Humanities Center to be a model of what it means to be dedicated to making our society a more enlightened and just place for everyone in our community. Oh, thank you very much. So it will be my honor later this evening to introduce and welcome to the stage Nicolas Pesce. But first, to get things underway, we're pleased to present Nick's brilliant and brilliantly horrific film, The Eyes of My Mother. So, in a few moments, it will be my pleasure to welcome to the stage Nicolas Pesce, whose fantastic film we all just experienced. In preparation, I'd like to take some time to reflect together on some of what we've seen, a closer look at a couple of themes, as it were. Indeed, let's talk for a couple of minutes about eyes. There are, of course, a lot of missing eyes in this film, missing voice boxes as well, but it's the eyes that really call our attention. Removing the eyes from someone is practically a good way to keep them from easily escaping captivity, but it is as well to deprive them of a world. In some sense, it might be to deprive them of being, deprive them of time, and symbolically at least, to take away any possible coming to meaning moment for their life. The German word Augenblick means moment in time, though it literally means the blink or glance of the eye. Philosophically, however, it's come to mean something more, a decisive moment when one's life takes on a new or newly changed meaning, the right or opportune moment when things come together. It's not just the quickness of this moment that's important here. It is rather that what makes seeing possible is the ability of the eye to blink, to not see, at least for a moment. In that momentary act of concealing, hiding, and being blind, the possibility of vision, and even the possibility of finding the meaning of one's life, is made real. There's no seeing without this concealing, no vision without the blink, no decisive moment without the Augenblick. To cut away the eyes, then, is not only to cut them out and be done with them, but to end the possibility of that blink, the moment, the temporality of our existence in which our becoming unfolds. Francisca, practicing the craft that her mother taught her, removes the being from the human being. This is all true, I think, and true as well is the importance of what the eye does not see in this film as opposed to what it does see. Color, of course, is missing, as are the majority of the most heinous acts of violence, each one occurring as a rule off screen. We never see the mother get murdered by Charlie. We never see how the father handles this initial confrontation with the murderer. We never see the father die, the girl Francisca picks up at the bar get dismembered, or even the death of Charlie. Though we hear the knife repeatedly plunged into him, we never see it. We usually don't even see the television in their home. That same episode of Bonanza repeating in the background is more of a constant droning noise in the life of these characters, the sort of white noise that novelist Don DeLillo so perfectly described, the sort of noise that substitutes the low hum of strangers talking for actual conversation with friends, enticing those of us who are lonely to turn on the TV when we're at home so we don't feel quite so isolated. In many ways, what we don't see in this film is importantly constitutive of the meaning of the film. The eye's momentary blindness that makes sense and import possible. But the truth is that it's another sort of eye that most interests me, the eye of the self, the ego, the individual, that capital letter I and all of its I-ness that makes it possible to be an individual. It's easy, I think, to see this film being about what happens to a person who's left in isolation, full of loneliness, raised without the guidance of enculturation. But what I'd like to propose is instead something that's somewhat the opposite. The problem is that Francisca has been perfectly enculturated, but it is into a culture, our culture, that is itself horrific. The film, then, is about us. It's about liberalism, and thus also ultimately about colonialism and immigration. Liberalism is the social political theory that founds our culture, political and otherwise. Liberal here doesn't mean the opposite of conservative. This is liberal with a capital L, like that capital I of the ego's eye. The Democrats and Republicans are both liberals because there's little room in our society for anything other than liberal theory that gave rise to all of this during the Enlightenment. The figures that most prominently shaped the systems of thought that gave structure to our contemporary worldview, René Descartes, Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson, all were the voices of liberalism, and all shared certain assumptions about what it is to be a self. Namely, that what it means to be a human is to be isolated, solipsistic, monadic, essentially cut off from others, connected only by means of a social contract, always selfish, inherently violent, necessarily untrustworthy. Our contemporary institutions of capitalism and democracy are tied to this conception of the self, of the I in isolation. Rejecting the idea of any community other than those forged by pacts of mutual interest, liberals value radical individuality. And so, yes, we might say that loneliness does strange things to the mind, but loneliness is the basis of our culture, the creator of the strange minds we all have. And what it means for an immigrant to assimilate is to become an appropriate liberal American self. So let's consider the possibility then that it's fundamentally important to the narrative of this film that Francisca's mother is not from the United States. Like many immigrants, she's had to give up a life over which she probably had some control and status in her homeland in order to come to America. No doubt most of us have had the experience of taking a taxi driven by someone who used to be a doctor or engineer or lawyer in his or her home country before moving to the US. We do not know the circumstances of Francisca's mother's immigration, but we know that she sacrificed, that she'd been a surgeon back home. And the film itself asks us to take up that immigrant's viewpoint, showing us in essence what it's like to assimilate into a mad culture. We may not see our own culture as crazy, but that is, after all, the point of culture. Culture is the normalization over time of mass behavior, even horrible mass behavior, until no one knows anything different, until that's just how life is. One of the things that this film accomplishes so brilliantly is exposing our own madness, I think. Even the title of the film makes it clear what our perspective is to be. If we think about it, in Portuguese, the title might be something like this: Os olhos da minha mãe. The best English translation would be to use the possessive, my mother's eyes. But a word-for-word translation, the sort of translation one might do if one were not fluent in English, if that is, one were a recent immigrant, would be literally the eyes of my mother. The fact that the film has the sort of title that a recent immigrant who's not completely fluent in English might give it is just the first sign that the general point of view of the film is that of the immigrant. Where are we in this film? It seems like it's probably somewhere in the American Midwest, though the truth is that it could be almost anywhere in the country. When are we in this film? It seems like the 1960s at first, perhaps the 1980s later, but the truth is that it could really be any place and any time. A small town that doesn't really change that much over the course of time. The particularities of place are not the concern of the immigrant. Francisca herself probably doesn't even know where she is. She's just in America. And so we, the viewers, are given that same experience. The film takes place in 20th century America. That's all we can say. But it's all we need to say. The pressure to assimilate is an horrific pressure, especially when one is assimilating into a culture of madness. We liberals are told that we do not have community into which we're born, that we have to use choice, our free individual choice, that most sacred of liberal values, and go out and make friends. And Francisca does exactly this. She literally makes friends, carving them up to fit her purposes, tying them up so they don't run away. Charlie is, in some sense, the perfect liberal friend, born out of multiple acts of violence, sewn and closed up to resemble something like a solipsistic monad, cobbled together to fit the desire of the self who only wants selfish companionship, always on her terms, always there for her, always made to be just as she wishes him to be. We point to someone such as Jeffrey Dahmer as the epitome of evil, but the truth is that Jeffrey, when he was caught, said that he was only trying to make friends. He was trying to turn those young men into what he called zombies, so that he could control them and make it such that they would always love him and never want to leave him. When pressed on it, all he would say is, I don't know, maybe I took it a little bit too far. We look at Jeffrey as if he is the aberration and the culture at large is sane, but can we be so sure? Perhaps, like Francisca, he just took up the liberal ideal, took it to its limit, took it a little bit too far to show us where it was ultimately already heading. I suppose one could think of Charlie then as the fully formed, homegrown liberal, and eventually Francisca does learn how to be just like him. She learns to think of the liberal's work as amazing. Eventually she adapts, adopts, and sees nothing wrong with the ethos of the culture that he represents. If anything, Charlie is the paradigm of that liberal mindset. We can even see him as the colonizer. What, after all, does the colonizer say to the so-called third world inhabitant when he reaches their shores?
May I come inside for a second? Just to use the restroom. It'll only take a second.
This is what the conqueror, passing himself off as just a passing visitor, always says. Cortez to the Aztecs, Columbus to the Native Americans, the Dole family to the Hawaiians, the United Fruit Company to the Caribbean. This is always the entree. Could I come inside for a second? Just to use something of yours. It'll only take a second. Of course it won't be for just a second. And of course he plans on taking whatever he wants for his own purposes. And of course the veneer of pleasantries makes it all the more sickening. But liberalism is always soaked through with please and thank yous, always ripping people apart and generally gutting the world in such a polite and civilized way. Civilization, after all, is merely barbarism masked in pleasantries. The music in the film continues this theme as well. We hear a couple of beautiful fados, a style of music at least 200 years old, originating in Portugal and associated with sadness, longing, and melancholia. As Kimberly DaCosta Holton, a professor at Rutgers and a fado historiographer, explains, fadistas over the last century have tended to focus on the sadness and loneliness of emigration, on losing their loved ones who travel overseas, leaving home for a new life in an adopted country. The records that Francisca plays, these songs to which she dances, are thus like the lamentations of the family left behind in a world she likely doesn't even know, but still might imagine to be less foreign than the one she lives in. One of the fados in the film thus weepily exclaims, "With what voice will I cry my sad fate, in which such hard passion imprisoned me?" Mother and daughter are lost, their family back home imprisoned by their sadness. All the while, another chained, blinded, muted prisoner languishes in the barn. It turns out that many things, especially horrors, are cyclical. And perhaps this is the final lesson I'd like to draw our attention to tonight about the eyes of my mother. Just as Portugal itself was once the seat of colonial power, but now it is subject to the power of American global capitalism and culture, so there is the eternal return, eternally returning in many different forms throughout the film. One wonders, for instance, why the father does not call the police when he captures Charlie. Perhaps it's just because he wants to torture Charlie to get his revenge, and he knows that the presence of the police would not allow this. But it's possible that there are more nefarious and hidden reasons for not contacting the authorities. We have no idea, after all, how the old man came to have Francisca and her mother in his life. It is possible, in fact, that they were stolen and kidnapped, just as Francisca does to Antonio later, and so he can't expose himself to the authorities. Even if this is not literally true, of course the old white male American can still be said to be the symbolic force that demands assimilation to his way of life, to his life. Once Charlie is gone, Francisca goes out to find, which is to say make, another lover, another friend. In the process of making this one, though, she ends up having to kill her as she killed Charlie, the cycle repeating, though too soon. The real replacement for Charlie will be Antonio's birth mother, as she takes up Charlie's old place in the barn, apparently just a few days later. Something like 7, 8, 9 years pass, and we see that Antonio is now a fully realized second-generation child immigrant. He's bilingual, completely immersed in the madness of his culture, knowing nothing else. But we have hints that he might be the true soul of the film, because he somehow seems able to see that something is wrong. He sees it not merely through the eyes of his mother. He sees suffering as suffering, and he sees what must be done. Like the communitarian who's able to recognize the fact that liberalism is a worldview that only leads to madness. Like the communitarian who redefines the I, the self, to be inherently connected to others, enmeshed and intertwined in a community of others with shared common goods and lives. Without even knowing that it's his birth mother, Antonio knows he is connected to the woman in the barn. And it's good, in fact, that he doesn't know exactly who she is, that he doesn't just care for family, but that he realizes that a stranger in his community who is in pain, well, she's still his responsibility, because it's his pain as well. He realizes that something has gone wrong here, even when the larger culture doesn't allow space for that evaluation. And yet, are we really left with hope? Because even if Antonio is the philosopher birthed of tragedy, who sees a way out, the power of that culture at large can be overwhelming. This is a culture that understands justice only in terms of violence. And so, just as was the case with Charlie, where justice meant torture as death, so Francisca meets her violent death as well. And as that gunshot rings out in the final moments of the film, we realize that Antonio has just witnessed the violent death of the woman he knows as his mother, just as Francisca had witnessed her mother's violent death before her eyes some years before. So is there hope for Antonio? In an Augenblick, a life can change. But true political, ethical, cultural change, that takes time. In an Augenblick, the trajectory of a life can be altered or further cemented. Will Antonio continue along his anti-liberal communitarian path? Or, caught up in this cycle of trauma, will he now only be able to see the world through his slain mother's eyes? The eyes of his mother. The eyes of which mother? The missing eyes of his rescued from the barn birth mother, who will surely only speak in praise of violent justice? Or the sad, dimming eyes of the woman he called mother? The woman who taught him what her adopted culture taught her. That love means control. That life means a fight at all costs against isolation. That God's brilliant sun makes all seeing possible, and that it shines equally on every creature, except for those we keep chained up in our barns. Friends, please join me in welcoming to the stage the writer and director of The Eyes of My Mother, the incredibly talented Nicolas Pesce.
Thank you guys all for coming. That was awesome.
Oh.
You've picked up on a lot of things that people don't usually.
Really?
Yeah.
Did it even ring true with you, or is it?
Very much so. I mean, there's one of the big things that, like, story-wise, no one ever picks up on, and it tends to be a popular Q&A question, but, like, why didn't the dad call the cops? And you had some very spot-on notions of why he didn't call the cops. Interesting.
It's always, of course, a fallacy to ask the creator of the art what it really means, because what it means is there in the art, right?
Yeah, but
there's something nice about hearing, yeah.
I mean, I also think, though, that, like, whenever I hear people talk about the movie, there's, like, you probably spoke more articulately than I can overall about the movie. Like, I think there's something about seeing it and analyzing it that is easier than like the philosophy of why you articulated the philosophy of why Antonio lets her out way more articulately than I could. Well, without a camera, that is.
Exactly. I think that's the point, right? So it's those of us who are not artists who are just sitting back and talking about this, but the truth is that it's there. That
yes,
you did say that, right? It's there.
Yeah.
And I think if any artist does more, then it becomes a kind of propaganda. It becomes a saying instead of showing.
Yeah.
So that's the beauty.
Yeah, I think that something that's so interesting about film is that it's a fallacy that the director is this, like, wrecking ball force that does everything and carries this thing on their back. And it's such a more collaborative experience. And for instance, things like the Fado, Kika, who plays Francisca in the film, and Francisca is actually her real name, and I did not know that. I met her as Kika, wrote the role for her, naming it Francisca after St. Francis, and then she was like, my real name is Francisca. That's weird. You know, she brought, we were looking for something that was music that would have been fabric of her childhood. And she came to me with Fado and Amaya Rodriguez and was like, this is what my mom listens to. And I put the song that she dances to for her dad in there, which was not the song that she was dancing to on set. And she tells me afterwards that I don't speak Portuguese in spite of the film being in Portuguese. She tells me that the title of the song is I'll Take Care of You Even After You Die. And it's her dancing for her dead father. And I was like, wow, you know, there's so much of film is like beautiful happy accidents that were sparked by someone's good idea somewhere. But I think that, yeah, you know, a lot of the stuff you talked about kind of grew organically out of her and exploring her character. And it's funny that you brought Jeffrey Dahmer up, because like I always go to him as like Jeffrey Dahmer killed and ate 17 people, and like that's what we know about him. But the guy went to work for nearly 10 years at a chocolate factory and had friends, and people knew him, and he did things outside of killing people. Over the course of 17 years, you know, you're spending a very small fraction of your time killing someone if you're a serial killer. And to fill all that other time, what does that look like? And so the movie kind of started there of like, here's this girl who essentially becomes a serial killer, and what does her life look like that fills it in more than just she killed all these people and did all these horrible things. What are the other things that happened that made her do that or make you think differently about those things?
That makes perfect sense. And there's so much in there, actually, what you just said. It just brings to mind the idea of our culture's tendency, I think, to reduce people to certain acts.
Definitely.
And that's an act of violence itself. My wife teaches at Steeves, which is a maximum security men's prison outside of Chicago. And she was just doing a class just the other week, and they were talking about I think it was a Platonic dialogue, and talking about Plato's argument against writing. And one of the arguments is that when you have writing instead of oral things, that the writing can go off and appear to speak to people, but the author is not really there, and so they can get the wrong idea. And then also they start thinking, oh, I know that writer. I know Socrates because I read this one thing by him, but that's not who I am. And Danielle told me when she came back from the prison that the guy said, oh, I understand that point completely, because it's just like how I feel. Society looks at me like I am this crime that I did. But it's one thing that I did, and I'm a lot more than that. And the good or badness of it is kind of a different kind of conversation.
Totally.
But somehow I really get that point, because I'm not just this one thing that happened this one time.
Yeah, and I think like crime, and especially reporting of crime, is super, super reductionist, you know? And I think that's kind of what the point of the ending is. People often ask me the movie ends so abruptly, and we don't really have any time to kind of think about anything or have anything tied up. And it's like, when you look at a guy like Osama bin Laden, we killed him and stopped talking about him. And it's like, it's that way with criminals. You know, the second that Timothy McVeigh was killed, again, it was like, that goes, and I bet you if you ask, I grew up and was living through that, and I was a kid when that was happening, but if you ask a kid today who's Timothy McVeigh, I bet they don't know who he is. And like, I think that for criminals, not that, you know, nowhere near trying to glorify what they do, but I think that there is so much more to learn about a person than this one thing that they did, because I'm more than a movie, and if you thought you knew me because you saw my movie, you'd be wrong. And it's the whole Hunter S. Thompson thing too, of like, you know, you can only know so much, even if I'm giving you everything. You still don't know what it's like when I'm alone. And I think so much of this movie was like, what does being alone look like for the person who does horrible things? And the answer is it kind of looks a lot like what it looks like if the person doesn't do horrible things.
And that seems like an important lesson. I think just a good human lesson.
Yeah.
Because just as you said, it's not to put off the question of guilt, but in some ways you can't even really begin asking the question of ethics when you just reduce somebody to one thing, or call them a monster too, because that's another thing, right? That Jeffrey Dahmer is a monster, or even Hitler is a monster, right? And then you say, well, monstrous things are done. But in some sense, the real ethics doesn't get done then, because This is not a monster, this is a human being who is capable of doing something so horrible.
That like we would never be able to do ourselves.
Exactly, right. So it's not in any way putting that person off the hook, but it's actually to really begin to engage with ethics to begin with, to say, this is something a human being did that is wrong. Now we need to talk about that, other than just having this category of the monster.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what draws me to I love true crime, and especially now we're in this like wave of all these true crime things, and I think what's so fascinating to me about just like criminals and criminology is that like, I'm a guy who like, if I stub my toe, I'm like, oh my god, I think I broke my foot, and like, the idea of hurting someone in a life-threatening way is like, nonsense to me, like, and I think that, I can't wrap my head around being in front of someone and being like, oh, I'm gonna kill you. Like, I just can't wrap my head around that, as most people probably can't. But then the fact that there are people who go and do this like for recreational reasons, like Jeffrey Dahmer killed recreationally and did it for so long that like, you do have to have a certain level of intelligence to get away with it, and that's dark and that's a horrible thing, but you can't be kind of like oblivious and just doing your thing and get away with killing people for 2 decades. Like, it really does take a certain level of planning and foresight. And it's like, if you just used those skills for something else, you probably would have been quite successful at it. And I think what's interesting for someone like Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy or any of these serial killers is you hear them speak and they're quite articulate and they're quite smart, and it's like, yeah, you would have been successful doing other things, and what made you say, nah, this sounds fun, and like, this is a good idea. And I think with Francisca, it was all about like, to me, I think it's too simple to say like, is it nature or nurture? It's like, it's everything. And I think that, to me, the biggest problem we have in terms of like creating criminals as a society is like normalizing violence. And I'm gonna sound like a hypocrite right now, but I think that like, I am someone who grew up watching really, really horribly violent things, and now I can watch stuff in movies that are really, really dark and not be fazed by it and recognize it's a movie, but there's a person who doesn't have that filter to be like, this is a movie and this is something that kind of gets me going, and like, I like this in a way that's not like, oh, exploration of violence, because there's plenty of things like, I don't think that the Saw movies have the like depth and nuance that something like Silence of the Lambs has, and I think that, you know, as you could tell from the movie, I'm not really interested in putting the violence on screen, and I'm not really interested in like showing you what violence looks like. I think that because I do think that part of the problem is like, kids with the internet today, it's like, people have seen way more people die, real videos of people dying now than they ever did 20 years ago. And the fact that that's just like a part of the consciousness is weird, and like, not necessarily a good thing unless you're exploring how that fits into how we live. And I think that with a lot of horror movies and like serial killer stories, it's like, look how crazy this serial killer is and how violent this is and how dark this is, and watch these girls run and scream. But like, the character behind Leatherface is so much more fascinating than any other character in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And what made this dude get his family to do this? Like, to me, that's what's interesting about horror, and it gives us the opportunity to get inside the psychology of someone who does something that we wish people didn't do. But this is a safe place to do it. And I think that, like, you know, Ted Bundy is someone who talks a lot about like pornography and movies and things being a big influence on him, and him wanting to feel that in real life. And I think that there's, like I said, I'm going to sound like a hypocrite because I think there's a duty that we have to explore it, but I think that there's also an exposure level now that's like reached such a high threshold that I think especially younger people don't feel the same way about like gun violence that that you know someone who's been to war feels about it. Like, you know, I think that that we've experienced a lot of trauma and violence and horror through movies, and as a result, like, you get a lot of these like young kids who don't have motivations for why they did this crazy shit. They're just like, I don't know, I just like wanted to kill all these girls, and that's horrible. And I think that, yeah, I think that it's just about exploring these characters, why these people do the things they do, and the beauty of movies is that for an hour and 17 minutes, I can make you kind of sympathize with someone who you would never sympathize with in real life, but hopefully you'll like walk out of the room and think about what that means for your life, what that means for the world. And I think that like there are so many people who kill people. It is a thing that we need to understand. The FBI is doing all the research and writing all the books, but no one's reading FBI dossiers on serial killers. No one's reading, there's like a 400-page book that is this FBI agent just sat in a room for 5 days with Jeffrey Dahmer and wrote down everything he said, and no one's read it. And I think that movies, fortunately, are like I can trick you into, like, this movie is not necessarily entertaining per se, but, you know, I can trick you into exploring this kind of side of like looking at these characters in the guise of a movie that like no FBI profiler is going to be like, check out my comic book that I snuck all my FBI research into. But I think that it is something that we need to think about, and people do kill a lot of people, and like, you know, you had the thing out in the lobby of like, if Chicago was a person, it would be a crazy serial killer, and it's like, this is a thing that happens everywhere, and kind of like, nowadays, serial killers are like, in the way of Jeffrey Dahmer of like 20 years and you kill all these people, is less now. We're living in this world of like mass shooters and all that. And I think that, yeah, like the psychology behind these people is something that for us to like stop this kind of stuff, we need to understand and think about more.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. And I think in some sense what you're also showing us is what was Jeffrey Dahmer like when he just went to CVS and went shopping, right? Or what was just an everyday moment?
Of course, I don't know, because I'm not a serial killer. but yeah, I think, and kind of my MO with all that was like, I think that in order, like a person is a person, and you still have to like eat dinner and clean your house and do things, you know, they're like, unless you're a total invalid, like no matter what you believe in, you have to like go about everyday life. And I think to me, it's so much scarier seeing someone like wash dishes when you know that they killed someone like 4 hours ago. And the fact that she can do these horrible things and then there isn't really any consequences, and then she just goes about her, and she's cleaning up blood the way she's cleaning up food that she would spill on the floor, because to her it is all the same thing. And like, she was desensitized to violence at a very young age, and like being in a world where it's like, this is all you know, and having this guy say to you like, well, why do you do it? It's like, because it feels awesome. And then to have that idea sitting in your head the same way that like, when I was that age, I heard Martin Scorsese say that being a movie director was awesome, and then I wanted to be a movie director, but like she was just imprinted with this like different thing and grew into it and had a moment where she was in a position to see if he was right or not, and she did it, and whatever things clicked in her, I liken her murder of Charlie to losing your virginity, and like she kind of like associated all these sentiments and feelings and circumstances with this moment that kind of repeats itself over and over and over again, and she's like chasing this thing that she doesn't know what it is or what it's supposed to be, but she's like was told by someone that that it might feel a certain way, and she watched it happen, and she had all these feelings, and now she's exploring it, and it's just, you know, more horrifying to watch because she's isolated and she doesn't have the kind of, you know, I think for most people, you have people around you that prevent you from doing these things, and you have a society and an infrastructure that's like, well, I don't need to kill anyone, and I don't want to kill anyone because all of these reasons. But for someone who doesn't have that context, and there is no concept of jail or ethics, and from an early age she's taught that, like, this guy who we read about in the Bible and that you're named after was actually probably a crazy person. And I think that there's just so many of these things that in isolation lead her to have just like a different outlook on the world. And in a way that I do think there was something like evil about Jeffrey Dahmer, I don't think there's something evil about Francisca, because she like does it. I always say that if someone told her, like, you're gonna go to jail if you do this, and this is what jail is, and it's bad, and this is why it's bad, she'd be like, oh my God, no, I don't want to do that. But she doesn't know any better, and does that. And I think that it's like guy like Ed Gein, and like there are plenty of guys who, you know, and obviously there's way more male serial killers than female serial killers, but like I think that a lot of these people are like that they were just like in isolation, don't know any better, and start doing these things and justifying them the way we do for all of our bad habits, but this habit is particularly dark.
Right, but then it's all about what gets defined as the bad habit, right? Because saying that Francisca she's been told something is worth chasing, so she just chases it, she's given some methodology to do that. I see the same thing happening with my students all the time, who are, well, I need to go to college. Why? Because you need a degree. Why? To get a job. Why do you want the job? Well, because you have to have a job to survive, to get the things that I need to live, a car, a house. But that's just because we've been told this is the only way to live, and this is what's going to make you happy. So in some sense, we are, I think, participating in a variety of murders of our own, too. We're destroying the planet, we're killing tons of animals and plants, and perhaps the whole way of life even. So it's all in how you define your terms, whether you're going to count yourself as one of the bad guys or the good guys, I think. Yeah. And I've been sort of, since I was bashing on liberalism earlier in the introduction, maybe I'll continue that for a second, too, because while you were talking, it seemed like there's no good place to turn, I think, in the Enlightenment and the tradition of liberalism to get out of the Enlightenment to get us out of this problem. So, for instance, in ethics, you have the two main ethical theories that come out of the Enlightenment that really found our entire culture, come from John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant. And so Mill is a utilitarian, and he says the correct ethical thing to do is whatever maximizes happiness. So the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Of course, that means that if torturing one person ends up making lots of people happy, that might be a good thing, right? And Kant has a very long, convoluted kind of argument about logic, and you must always follow this very abstract internal logic that he calls the categorical imperative. But Kant, for instance, says that when you are making ethical decisions, you're in some sense a more ethical person if you really think about it and then make a choice. Like, if I think, well, should I kill Nick or not tonight while we're talking? And then I think, no, I shouldn't, because the categorical imperative says that if I universalized it, it would have a logical contradiction, so it's wrong. And then I don't kill you, that somehow that makes me a good person because I did ethics, right? But wouldn't it be much better if it just never occurred to me to do that? But there's sort of no room in the Enlightenment to talk about why that's the case. It's always about this individual, rational, isolated choice, instead of talking exactly about what puts us in the ethical milieu that we are, and that is the culture and the ethos that gives rise to that. So that's, like, I guess, some of what I was trying to talk about before, that the nature-nurture question it's a kind of liberal question in the sense that you have to choose one or the other, when it's a really complicated thing. How the world appears to me is a question of how the world has appeared to me in the past and the way in which it's been allowed to appear to me by the people who have been in my life. But then within that, I make certain choices, but there's a lot you're not in control of.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, one of the greatest non-Enlightenment philosophers, Aristotle, said it's all about the development of character and then acting out of character. But even Aristotle says there's something called moral luck. And that is, if you're just born into the right family or the right time or the right circumstances, some people are going to get off on a better foot than others.
Yeah, and I think that it's, I think part of what I was trying to do with Antonio's character is young Francisca and Antonio find themselves in not exactly the same circumstances, but similar circumstances and witnessing things that children of their age should not witness and being kind of isolated and having this bizarre upbringing. But Antonio does something totally different with it. And there's, you brought up the TVs, there's like, so yeah, when Francisca's a kid, it's always Bonanza on TV, and it's what her dad was watching. But when Antonio's watching TV, he's watching Vincent Price's House on Haunted Hill, and it was my little in-joke of like, the kid who ultimately does the good thing is the kid who's watching the horror movie. I think that that's part of the magic of filmmaking, that like everyone has their own experience with it. And I think for me, making horror films, like I said before, the jump scare only does so much, and I think that what's cool about horror movies is like what's cool about heavy metal music to me. And that's like, you can, first of all, like I feel like making horror movies, if you can do a horror movie well, it's like doing punk rock well. It's like, I feel like it's an edgier, and it's probably because I'm sure like sci-fi dudes say the same thing about sci-fi, but I think that there's something awesome about it just being an edgier genre. But like, I want to if I make you feel like, oh my God, I have to get out of here, that's just as good as being like, that was awesome. And I think, you always hear about like, the worst thing you can do is have something that, yeah, that's all right, and then not think anything of it. Like, I've had so many people come up to me and be like, dude, why did you do that? Like, oh God, it's like, that's why I did that, to have you do that. And I think, for me, it's about getting like, an extreme reaction that's not from shock. Because like, I think that as much as I do love to do, like for instance, we shot the murder of the girl she brings home from the bar and chose not to use it in the movie. Oh, really? And I think that while I can watch movies that have like shock and gore in them, I think that for many people, it takes them out of it. And I'm not trying to give you a reaction of like, oh my God, that's so gross. I want you to have like a way more intellectual, oh, that's gross, That
makes sense. One of my favorite David Lynch stories actually is that he was talking about Lost Highway, and I think it was 2000, 2001, and somebody asked him, what does it mean? Which is not the thing to ask David Lynch what your movie means. And he turned around and he said, it's all about the O.J. Simpson trial. Which, if you've seen the movie, it doesn't make any sense at all, right? And that's awesome. Would you like to elaborate on that? And he said, no, I would not.
Yeah.
But Lynch, since you mentioned him, he seems like somebody who, it's almost everything he does is horror, because he just sees every moment of everyday life as somehow horrific.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I love David Lynch so much, is that he's like a horror director who doesn't have any horror things in his movie. Like Mulholland Drive has a couple of like more traditional horror scenes.
The old people who are
and then like the jump scare behind Winky's Diner,
right,
and then the old woman who's like the neighbor who comes to the door and is like, there's something bad here.
Right.
But I think that what's cool to me about the genre of horror is like David Lynch proves, you can have a girl in a pink sweater walking down a hallway and there's no story thing in there, but the filmmaking can make that scary. And like I think that film to me, I was a kid who got scared really, really easily. Like when I was growing up, I could watch old horror movies, and that's like why I like the stuff that I do. And so like Night of the Hunter, I could watch, but like The Ring, I was not gonna watch as a kid. Like that would have ruined me. And I'm an anxious person, and I think that what draws me to horror is like, there's very few things that I can make you feel the way I felt when I was 12 and tried to watch the Mothman Prophecies and was like, nope, no, that's a terrible, you guys have seen it? Or if you haven't seen it, don't. It's a terrible movie. It was the thing of like, I will never forget what horror movies and scary stories and made me feel as a kid and what anxiety makes me feel as an adult. And film, you know, in painting, in photography, you can make a frightening image, but nothing quite like film can I like grip you and mess with your fear and anxiety emotions. And it's something that I equate to like, in comedy, you have to make people laugh, and that's like a really hard thing to do. And in horror, you have to scare people, which is just like the opposite of it. But like, I think it's easier to make you, it's easier to do the things that like dramas do than to scare you. You know, like scaring you takes, not only do I have to do all the story things to make you like feel for the character, but I have to like take it one step further and make it visceral enough for like your heart to race and to give you like a physical reaction the way a comedy does. And like you can watch a great drama and be moved by it, but not physically, and you know, maybe it'll bring you to tears, but that doesn't happen that often, whereas like in even a bad comedy, you're probably gonna laugh once, and in a bad horror movie, you might get your heart racing once. And I think that that's an awesome, I'm not funny, so I can't do comedies, but horror, you know, I think that that's an awesome experience that, that you can kind of, mess with people physically like that.
In some ways, don't you think, I guess it's always seemed to me that the idea of genre does more damage than it does help. In the sense that when you categorize something, then it's like you know what it is and you have preconceptions about it. It's almost as if the concept does the thinking for you and then you don't have to think, which is precisely why I like thinking about David Lynch as a horror person. Or, I mean, this is kind of a crazy idea too, but I always thought that Willy Wonka, like Gene Wilder, that's like a horror movie, but it just doesn't have the horror payoff.
The Oompa Loompas are like the scariest creatures.
Super scary, right?
Yeah.
And there's just something so off about him that he's almost like Charlie at any moment.
Well, okay, I mean, I said to Will, I want you to be like Willy Wonka in the tunnel scene when you say onwards and upwards. That was like my direction to him. I mean, Willy Wonka, still to this day, one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. Like but for different reasons. And some of the things that David Lynch does of like, there's something, John Waters is the king of it, there's something about making something that superficially looks glossy and pretty and fun for kids that isn't. And kind of like those layers of like what it looks like on the outside versus what it's actually doing is something that's really scary.
That makes perfect sense.
But to your question about genre, I think that I'm someone who like people, you know, especially now, they're like, oh, well, there's horror and there's post-horror and there's it's not really a horror, it's a thriller. It's like, at the end of the day, I think the damage is more in us thinking a horror movie is one thing and a sci-fi movie is one thing. Because to me, like, Silence of the Lambs is a horror movie and is a thriller and is a drama, and like, as far as I'm concerned, the second that you have a serial killer or a ghost in a movie, it's a horror movie just because of like the content of it. And to me, I'm someone, like I said before, like about with my like analogy to punk music, I'm someone who like wants horror movies to be like not this marginalized, like bottom shelf at the video store sort of thing. Like horror fans, I mean, right now, horror movies, like, financially are the new action movies. You know, like, Blade Runner did shittily, and it is the highest grossing movie ever almost. And like the fact that horror for the longest time has kind of been marginalized to like, well, it's like, oh, I don't really watch horror movies, and it's treated like this other thing. It's like, yeah, people will watch Star Wars and not watch a horror movie, but it's like sci-fi and horror are very close together. And
think of Alien.
Exactly.
It's just almost a straight up horror movie.
Totally, and people will watch it more than a horror movie because it's a sci-fi movie. But I think that part of what I want to do is like, you look at other cultures and their horror movies, and like in Korea, like what they consider a horror movie is very widespread and awesome. And I think that here, when you say horror movie, people think either like Rob Zombie or they think like 80s horror movies. And fortunately now we're going through this like new wave of better genre films. But I hear like Robert Eggers, who directed The Witch, say that The Witch isn't a horror movie. And it's like, no, dude, like wear that badge proudly and like make horror better, rather than saying I don't want to be associated with this thing that you think less of. I want you to think that this is part of that, so you think that this genre is better. And like, we gotta elevate the genre, because you look at, Alfred Hitchcock was a filmmaker who almost exclusively made horror films, and is considered one of the greatest filmmakers ever, but no one, and if you ask anyone what his best films are, it's the horror movies. Like, very few people are saying like, oh, Shadow of a Doubt is way better than Psycho. It's like, no, it's not. And Shadow of a Doubt's a great movie, but it's not better than Psycho. And I think that there's plenty of these guys who are considered really amazing filmmakers with such a huge legacy that only made horror movies, that we kind of like act like they didn't only make horror movies.
Right. And for those of you who are interested, Robert Eggers, by the way, is going to be with us a year from tonight. He's our guest for the 2018 Worthy Maze.
Call his movie a horror movie.
Yeah. No, but it's a really good point, because at the very end, right, when Black Phillip says, "What wouldst thou want?" then it's pretty clear. But before that, I think that's a horror movie, because the tone and also just this sense of
it's called The Witch.
And it's called The Witch too, right? But this overwhelming sense of patriarchy having its weight on the little girl, that it's terrifying.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that part of what's fun about horror now, that is more accepted now than it has been since like the 50s, is that like you can kind of, the new tradition of horror is like, make your movie about something real and then stick horror elements in there to heighten it. And The Witch is about, women's roles in family and society, and young girls and puberty and sexuality, and
exactly.
And then it brings supernatural stuff in there to kind of heighten and elevate it. This is about loneliness and loss and relationships, and there's horror stuff in there to elevate it. And I think that that's what's exciting to me about the genre now, in the way that sci-fi was exciting in the 70s for that reason. It was like a platform for philosophy that you could just have different costumes and sets, and I think that it is an awesome place to deal with all that stuff in a way more extreme way, and to have it be a little more viscerally exciting.
I think of the movie Get Out too, by Jordan Peele. It's the sort of fitting.
Yeah, like a movie, it's literally like, I can't even think of a movie that's talked about racism the way that has a period in the past 10 years, and that's a horror movie. It's a Blumhouse horror movie. And like, up until that, Blumhouse was like, oh yeah, you guys are the guys who make like 20 movies a year and 3 of them are seen. And now it's like, no, we're gonna like make a statement about society and it be hugely financially successful, hugely successful critically, and hugely successful to audiences who really connected with things in there that were way deeper than the horror elements themselves. And I think that like more and more we need to like rid the world of the sentiment of like, oh, I don't watch horror movies, because people don't say like, oh, I don't watch comedies, like, oh, I don't watch, you know. And if you were like, for movie buffs, there's plenty of people who just don't like movies and, you know, whatever. But I think that if you like movies, horror is one of the few genres that people will say like, I don't watch horror movies, and like make a sweeping statement like that. And my friends, like, I have friends that have to this day not seen my movie because they won't watch horror movies. It's like, you gotta
the violence of the
that.
concept, right?
And
the concept does all the thinking for them, and then.
But I think that it's more about changing that perception than like ridding. Because whenever I hear Robert Eggers say it's not a horror movie, I'm like, your movie's called The Witch. It is a horror movie. Embrace it, and change the way people think about it. You know, like nowadays we have It Follows, we have The Witch, we have A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. The context for, and then even like the Conjuring movies, the Insidious movies, we have a context for like horror movies that are about other things than just being scary. And you know, one of the projects that I'm working on next is a remake of a J-horror thing, and one of the things has the constant conversation is like, J-horror did something awesome at the end of the 90s. They like capitalized on a thing that we weren't doing in American horror, and it really, really worked. And today that really, really does not work. But it was getting at something in us that that was interesting and effective. And now it's like not about ridding ourselves of all these things that were tropes and have now become cliches, but like embracing the things that worked and changing people's perception of what a cliche is. Because honestly, you watch any of these superhero movies now, and they're like riddled with cliches, but people don't care. You know, if you do it in a certain way, you know, to me, cliche is like, if you do cliche well, like everything in Stranger Things is cliche. They just do it really well, so you love it. And
kind of the point of it.
Exactly. And so to me, it's like, find the things that work, embrace the things that work, and then push it and do whatever you want with it and make it cool. And now, like, horror movies are starting to be more than they were, and I think that, unfortunately, this does play a big role in it, but like box office numbers going up for horror movies are getting more people to go see horror movies, and it sucks that you need a movie like It to get people to be like, oh wow, should I go see that? Everyone's going to see it. But it is good, and I do want to call this movie a horror movie, and I want, you know, to keep making horror movies, and I just want my horror movies to be more of the Charles Laughton, Alfred Hitchcock, Robert Wise kind than the, you know, 90s Rob Zombie, Wes Craven thing, which I love as a fan, but as a filmmaker, I'm just not as interested in.
We didn't even have a chance to talk about Charles Laughton, but I could say this: I'm not worried about the future of horror as a genre, or worried about film, or worried about art with such an incredible voice as yours taking us into the future. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Nick. Please everyone join me in thanking Nick Pesce.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Good night.